Hello and welcome to our 9th lecture as we get moving along through the final couple of lectures on simply about brain and brain structures. Today we're going to talk about subcortical brain structures. And while this looks like a pretty long bit of material, we'll kind of dive kind of shallowly into these items and just provide some basic information about these structures, where they are and what they do. So we'll start with the spinal cord, work our way up to the hindbrain, or the brainstem as it's often called, the midbrain, the cerebellum, the basal ganglia, the limbic system, the thalamus and hypothalamus, and then finally I want to talk a little bit about what's called the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Let's start with that spinal cord. The spinal cord communicates with somatosensory systems and our muscles, except for those of the face and the skull. Those are occur through the cranial nerves. So the entering dorsal roots carry sensory information, and the exiting ventral roots carry motor information. So those nerves exiting on the backside of your back, so to speak, are the dorsal roots. Those are carrying sensory information into the spine. The exiting ventral roots, those that are closer to your chest, carry motor information. And so those are heading off towards the muscles. There are cell bodies of the sensory neurons are actually located in clusters of neurons outside the spinal cord. We often refer to these as the dorsal root ganglia. And that's where that sensory information is being processed by those cell bodies. So you can see the spinal cord here. We have the dorsal columns, the dorsal horn, the ventral horn. There is gray matter here inside the spinal cord itself. These are interneurons that actually communicate directly between the senses and the motor system for reflex arcs. So for example, you can see this in the bottom half of this figure on the right. Skin receptors, let's say you touch something hot, it's going to create a short circuit across these interneurons to the motor neurons to get you to pull that away immediately. So that reflex arc occurs without the brain's involvement at all. Gets us to the hindbrain. Often, again, this is called the brain stem, particularly this lower area here. This is where the spinal cord is entering the brain. We have a number of important structures here that sort of top out here at the thalamus. The thalamus is actually not part of the midbrain or the hindbrain, but is actually part of what's called the diencephalon. But the medulla and some of these midbrain structures, depending on who you ask, might be included in the brainstem. Sorry. So let's start with the medulla, then we'll talk a little bit about the cranial nerves. I do not expect you to memorize the cranial nerves as part of this course. And then we'll get to the pons after that. So the hindbrain includes the medulla. It's located just above the spinal cord. It's sort of like an enlarged extension of the spinal cord. And this part of the brain is responsible for our vital reflexes. This is what keeps us breathing, keeps our heart beating. This is also what causes things like vomiting, saliva, coughing, and sneezing. All of these are occurring at or are being generated by the medulla. Some other parts of the brainstem the medulla are also involved in things like your pupillary response. So what's called the consensual pupillary response is also a brainstem function. Medulla function. So the problem with this is you can actually be breathing, your heart can keep beating if the medulla is intact. The problem is, of course, when people are what we would refer to as brain dead because there's no cortical activity, the medulla can keep their heart beating and keep them breathing. But even when somebody can't feed themselves or drink. And so this is one of the areas of the brain that you can still have activity, but little hope that somebody could survive without being hooked up to respirators and feeding tubes and etc. So the cranial nerves then are allow the medulla to control sensations from the head, muscle movements in the head, and many sympathetic and parasympathetic responses. So that pupillary response, for example. So there are also some perceptual functions of the cranial nerves. So I want to run through these, and as I said, I don't expect you to memorize them. But we have the trochlear nerve, the optic nerve, and the oculomotor nerve. All of these are involved in visual processing, moving the eyes, etc. We have the olfactory nerve, which is our sense of smell. The trigeminal nerve, which is primarily facial nerves. The glossopharyngeal and the hypoglossal are involved in moving the tongue, swallowing, that sort of thing. The accessory nerve here, the vagus nerve. This is involved in what's called the vagus response. So oftentimes people will faint when they see a needle, for example. People who are afraid of needles, that vagus response drops their blood pressure very rapidly because it's connected to internal organs. The vestibulocochlear nerve is processing auditory information from the auditory nerve, as well as balance information from the vestibular apparatus. And finally, we have the facial nerve, which is involved in processing or making facial expressions. You can see it's tied into the muscles. So the facial nerve is a muscular nerve. The trigeminal nerve is sensory. The pons then lies on each side of the medulla. There is a ventral and anterior. Ventral and anterior to each side of the medulla. The term pons is Latin for bridge, and essentially the pons is where the axons cross to the other side of the spinal cord. So remember, the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. Left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. Those neurons cross over at the pons. So you can see that. Actually, I don't know that you can see it in here. Anyway, so this is the hindbrain. That gets us to the midbrain, and some people call this the mesencephalon. Some people call it the midbrain. What people put in the midbrain versus the hindbrain really depends on who you ask. You can see the pons here, just underneath the tegmentum of the midbrain. The tegmentum is the floor of the midbrain. The tectum is the ceiling of the midbrain. The tectum is at the roof of the midbrain and controls a lot of these reflexive pathways we were just talking about. The next stop in the midbrain are the superior and inferior colliculi. These are involved in sensory information. So, for example, at the superior colliculus, you will get integration of sensory information. So you get both auditory and visual information being processed at the superior colliculi. There's a lot of really interesting research on perceptual ability of, say, animals in the superior colliculus. So barn owls, for example, have 3D maps. Overlapping maps of their visual and auditory system, so they can hunt prey based on both sound and vision. It's one of the reasons why they're such effective predators. So then the tegmentum is the floor of the membrane that contains a number of nuclei for cranial nerves and part of what's called the reticular formation. Also includes what's called the para-aqueductal gray, the red nucleus, and the ventral tegmental area. The para-aqueductal gray is important when we start talking about pain perception and pain drugs. The ventral tegmental area is an important part of what's called the reward pathway. So we will be getting into some important issues with those as we work throughout the semester. Final stop off on the midbrain is the substantia nigra. This is the starting point for the basal ganglia. So it gives rise to the dopamine-containing pathway that facilitates readiness for movement. Very easy to see on this magnetic resonance imaging slice. There where the arrow is pointing, the substantia nigra means black body. And so they're very easy to spot right there in these dark areas. Substantia nigra are also part of what's called the basal ganglia, and we'll talk about those here in just a moment. Cerebellum is a structure located in the hindbrain with many deep folds. Cerebellum means small brain. In fact, it looks like a little brain. It kind of looks like cauliflower. Cerebellum is highly involved in regulating motor movement and balancing coordination and timing of movements. It's also an important structure for shifting attention between auditory and visual stimuli. Interestingly, it actually modulates the ipsilateral muscle, so the right side of the cerebellum modulates the right side of the body, which is unusual for the brain. Some important areas of the cerebellum that we will talk more about when we start talking about action. Excuse me, coffee hasn't kicked in. Is the vermis. This links somatosensory and kinesthetic information to the ventromedial tracts. The damage to this particular part of the cerebellum can result in postural loss and difficulty in locomotion. So difficulty walking and in maintaining posture. The ventromedial tracts and the motor system are involved in, primarily, as I recall, maintaining posture and anything that's bilateral, like walking. Walking and maintaining posture are both bilateral. And so the vermis is involved in that. The intermediate zone forms a loop between the red nuclei and somatosensory information from the spinal cord, and damage here results in an inability to make smooth movements to a target location. So this is the kind of thing where we get integration between sensory information and motor information. And so as you're trying to reach over to grab something, you need that sensory information to tell you how fast you're moving, where you've moved to, how far you've moved, as well as when you've arrived, say when you're reaching over to grab the mouse to your computer. So damage to this particular area makes it hard to make that movement smooth because the motor information is not getting that sensory information that it needs to calibrate those movements. Finally, the lateral zone is involved in a number of movements. A ballistic movement. So these are things that occur very quickly. So if you're going to throw a ball, if you're going to reach out to grab something that's dropping, these occur quickly and they don't have time to be modified by feedback. So ballistic movements happen very rapidly and generally without any time to consciously control them. To give you an example from my own personal experience and my own stupidity, when I was younger, I worked at a food court restaurant in which we had a French fryer, and I was doing something and I dropped a pair of tongs into the French fryer, which was on, and I reached in and grabbed the tongs out without thinking. That's that kind of sudden ballistic movement. I was fine. Fortunately, the ice machine was right behind me, so I just shoved my hand in the ice, and it was a little red, but it wasn't burnt at all. Really quite a miracle. So that's ballistic movement. Multi-joint movements, so, grasping things, your hands, that sort of thing. Learning of new movements. We'll get into that when we start talking about implicit memory. And then finally, temporal processing and timing of movements. So trying to catch a moving ball, for example, requires a great deal of temporal processing and timing of movements to make sure that you catch that at the right moment. So that's the lateral zone. The basal ganglia then are involved primarily in the motor system as well. You'll start to learn when we get to movement and the motor systems, it's very complicated, and there's a lot of parts of the brain involved. So the striatum, which includes oftentimes the caudate nucleus putamen and nucleus accumbens. Again, it depends on who you ask as to what goes into this. These are involved in movement as well as the nucleus accumbens is involved in the reward pathway and our feelings of reward. The globus pallidus has an inhibitory effect on the thalamus. One of the ways in which we oftentimes correct for damage caused by Parkinson's disease is by ablating or removing the globus pallidus, and therefore then removing this inhibitory effect. The substantia nigra, this is sort of key to the nigrostriatal pathway. This is where most of the damage to Parkinson's disease, most of the damage caused by Parkinson's disease occurs, is in the substantia nigra. It's a loss of dopaminergic neurons in this particular part of the pathway. And then finally, the subthalamic nucleus. All of these are considered part of the basal ganglia, and you can see them here. We have the substantia nigra, which is that black body, located very adjacent to the hypothalamus and the subthalamic nuclei. Then we have the putamen, the thalamus, the caudate nucleus. All of these are sort of considered part of the striatum. I don't think they should. I don't have the nucleus accumbens here. But these are the basal ganglia and are involved in this complex motor circuit we'll talk about more later on in the term. Finally, we get to the limbic system. The limbic system is a number of interlinked structures. Again, what goes in the limbic system depends on whom you ask. So the olfactory bulb is most certainly part of the limbic system. This is where olfactory or our sense of smell is processed. It's located directly adjacent to the amygdala, as well as the hippocampus. And so there is some belief this is the reason why scents can arouse emotions and be tied directly into memory as a potent memory cue, because the hippocampus is involved in memory and the amygdala is involved in emotional processing. The hypothalamus is an important part of the command and control structure for our hormones, as well as part of the feelings of reward. So it's tied in along with memory as well as our emotions. And then finally, the cingulate gyrus of the cerebral cortex. Lots of involvement in spatial processing, memory, and other areas that we'll visit throughout the semester. Let's take a look at these. So here we have the amygdala, which is an almond-shaped structure located adjacent to the hippocampus. The olfactory bulb would be right here, sort of at the end of the cingulate gyrus, right above the amygdala. The cingulate gyrus wraps around the corpus callosum and is, again, very important in a variety of cognitive processes. We'll get into talking about the fornix, the entorhinal cortex, and the hypothalamus, and the ways in which they're involved, as well as the mammillary bodies, when we get to talking about memory. So the thalamus and the hypothalamus are often called the diencephalon. The thalamus is the relay station from our sensory organs and is our main source of input to the cortex. We'll spend a great deal of time talking about the lateral geniculate nucleus as well as the medial geniculate nucleus. The LGN, or lateral geniculate nucleus, is involved in visual processing. The medial geniculate nucleus, or MGN, is involved in auditory processing. The hypothalamus is a small area near the base of the brain, conveys messages to the pituitary gland to control the release of hormones. It's associated with a variety of behaviors, particularly motivational behaviors and homeostatic behaviors, such as eating, drinking, sexual behavior. And together, these two structures form what is often called the diencephalon. And so they are involved in a variety of processes that we're going to be talking about throughout the semester. So that's the thalamus and the hypothalamus. I want to finish with what's called the HPA axis, and this stands for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So we've talked about the hypothalamus and the pituitary very briefly. The adrenal cortex is located atop the kidneys and is actually part of the endocrine system. So stress tends to activate two systems in the body. The sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight response that prepares the body for brief emergency responses. So basically arouses everything so that you have energy to fight or flee. The HPA axis, this hypothalamic pituitary and adrenal cortex, also becomes activated, and this becomes the dominant response during prolonged stressors. An activation of the hypothalamus induces the pituitary gland to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, much easier to say, than adrenocorticotropic hormone. Basically, this is released by the pituitary gland, which travels through the bloodstream and causes the adrenal cortex to secrete cortisol. So during a stress response, we get the release of norepinephrine by the sympathetic nervous system. And we're going to talk about how norepinephrine affects cognition in a variety of places, but essentially it hones our attention immediately to allow us to focus on threats. There is some belief that it might actually improve episodic memory for those times when it's active. In fact, we're pretty sure that it does. And it also has an emotional component to memory. And so if you remember from the Memory Hackers video I had you watch at the beginning of the semester, you saw how by blocking the release of norepinephrine during a retrieval episode, they were able to actually influence the emotional component of memory. Cortisol, however, has very deleterious effects on both cognition and memory. And in particular, cortisol really zaps short-term and working memory, and also causes pretty significant damage over time to the hippocampus, which is the part of the brain primarily responsible for creating our memories. And so we end up with damage to the hippocampus, some areas in the prefrontal cortex. That cortisol release caused by long-term stress is actually what's the primary risk factor for major depressive episodes and depression because of the damage cortisol causes to those areas. We know that there are a variety of ways to reduce the amount of cortisol that gets released during a stressful episode, including diet and exercise. So as we start looking at how our life and our lifestyle intersects with our brain, we'll be then moving on to talking about how that intersects with cognition. So it's going to be an important part of that conversation is how to limit cortisol release and how to inoculate us against the effects of stress. So cortisol helps us to mobilize energies to fight a difficult situation, but over time, it starts to cause damage and has pretty significant effects on cognition. So we'll be spending quite a bit of time talking about these issues and these particular hormones as we move throughout this semester. All right, that is, one One last slide here just to show you this whole process. Hypothalamus releases ACTH, or causes the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. That travels through the bloodstream down to the adrenal cortex, located right here atop the kidneys, and those then release cortisol. All right, that's our introduction to subcortical brain structures. Up next, the cerebral cortex.